What has shocked police is the ferocity of the murders. A senior officer said Sam Bissett's injuries were horrific.
I remember going into the room and for that split second, I thought it wasn't her, because her hair was dark. And then I moved forward and you just see a little button nose and a little freckle. And that was it.
The image that really is very, very difficult is her beautiful engagement ring with all that hope in it on a very dead hand.
The teenager's bloodied and half-naked body was found by a neighbour on the drive of her home.
And I see a tiny wound to her neck, and Michelle was just screaming and crying, asking me to wake her up. Please wake her up, Mum.
He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot.
He's probably one of the most frightening individuals that I've had the opportunity to deal with in my police career.
It's the evening of the 24th of September 2005 in Croydon, Surrey. 18-year-old Sally Ann Bowman was celebrating a friend's birthday, partying in one of their favourite bars.
Sally Ann had gone out with one of her sisters and some other friends into Croydon, and Sally Ann had spent most of the evening up to the early hours in Croydon town centre. She was picked up by Lewis Sproston and he drove her back to Blenheim Crescent, which is where she lived.
Lewis and Sally Ann's relationship had ended a few weeks before, and with emotions still running high, the couple began arguing in the car. This argument continued for over an hour and a half, until finally, Sally Ann got out of the car and Lewis drove off.
It was probably around about 4:15 that Lewis drives away from Blenheim Crescent, looks in his rearview mirror, and apart from the actual murderer, was the last person to see Sally Ann alive.
The brutality of the crime scene allowed police to put together Sally Ann's last moments alive. Standing alone on her driveway, she was subjected to a very sudden, very violent assault, less than 10 metres from her own front door.
We know that Sally was stabbed at least 7 times. Of those 7, 3 of them were so strong, the stab wound, that they passed through her body. 2 went through her abdomen and out the back. She had been bitten a number of times. There was a number of areas on her body, including the bite marks, that yielded DNA. We were also able to ascertain that Sally Ann had also been raped. And the evidence suggested that that had occurred after she had been killed.
The events that led to this shocking crime, committed in a quiet suburban street, began almost 24 hours earlier. Sally Ann had spent the previous night at her mum's house and was looking forward to a relaxing weekend.
Sally Ann had woken up and just laid about all day in her pink fluffy dressing gown, watching telly, munching on biscuits and crisps and God knows what. And then the phone went a couple of times. It was Sister Nicole asking if she'd like to go out for the evening, as it was Nicole's best friend's birthday. It was about 6:05 in the evening on the Saturday the 24th, and I went to the door, and Sally just said, "Love you, Mum." I said, "Love you too." It was the last time I saw her.
Sally Ann met up with her sister and her friends and went to one of their favourite bars in the town centre to enjoy a girls' night out.
When she was 18, she was an adult, just. And she was very streetwise, so, you know, even if I had, there probably wouldn't have been many concerns. You wouldn't expect that maybe the next few hours she'd be laying in a pool of her own blood, would you? I've seen the CCTV footage. She was at the bar, she was laughing, flicking her hair about, giggling, and according to Nicole, they had an absolute excellent night. And at the end of the night, she went back home with Nicole, but in the meantime of the journey, she was having a conversation with Lewis on the phone and got it into her head that she really wanted to see Lewis. So she arranged to go get a cab from Nicole's back into Croydon, where Lewis then went and picked her up.
Sally Ann was in Blenheim Crescent with her ex-boyfriend Lewis Sproston in a car outside of the address that she was living at, where she rented a room. And they were in that car probably from about 2:30 until at least 4:15. What we know from a witness is that about 4:15 that Sunday morning, the witness woke up because they heard what they described as a garbled sound, which ended in a scream. Now, they looked out of their window, which looked onto the location that Sally Ann was eventually discovered, but couldn't see anything. It was very still, there was no other noise. They left their window, but returned about 5 minutes later, hadn't switched their bedroom lights on or anything like that, and they looked out and they saw a man walk down the street in the direction of where Sally Ann was eventually found. They then didn't see or hear anything else, and they went back to bed. It's about 6:30 on the Sunday morning when a neighbour saw what they described as a pair of mannequin legs sticking out from behind a builder's skip. They went over to have a look and discovered the body of Sally Ann, partially clothed and clearly dead at that point in time.
As the murder squad assembled and began their initial investigations, detectives had to break the news to Sally Ann's family.
I heard the door knock and I just assumed it would be Sally Ann. I was sort of panicking, thinking, oh God, the door's all locked up, she can't get in. And as I opened the door, there was a gentleman standing in a suit.
Yes.
Do you know Sally Ann Bowman?
Yeah, she's my youngest daughter.
2 female police officers in uniform, and sort of took back a bit, and they asked me if I was Linda Bowman, and I said, I am. They said, do you know Sally Ann Bowman? And I said, yes, she's my youngest daughter.
So you know Sally Ann Bowman?
He didn't actually say to me, are you on your own? You know, I have some terrible news for you. Is there anyone you can have with you? He just repeated the question again, do you know Sally Ann Bowman? And I said, look, I've told you, she's my youngest daughter. I said, what have they done now? Thinking, oh, the girls have been out, something's gone wrong. And he said, Linda, Sally Ann's dead, she's been stabbed to death. I just remember screaming, absolutely screaming. I just couldn't believe it. And just my whole world fell apart.
I just remember this look in their eyes where you just know there's something that's not quite right. And they said, oh, do you know Sally Ann Bowman? And me, I went, what's she done? No care in the world. Like, Ella was sitting on my lap, she was only little. And they said, I'm really sorry to tell you, but Sally was found murdered this morning. And I remember something leaving me that day. And it's never ever come back. I remember sitting there screaming and Ella sitting on my lap saying, Mummy, what's wrong? And I just said, don't worry, Mummy's got something in her eye. And she said, I'll kiss it better, Mummy. I'll make it all better for you. But there's not anything in this world that will ever make it better, because she'll never come back.
Within hours of the murder inquiry being launched, the spotlight began to fall on one of the last people to see Sally Ann alive.
Very quickly, we identified her ex-partner, Lewis Sproston, as someone who was a possible suspect.
He was your typical teenage boy. You know, he went out to work, he worked. You know, he had a lot of respect for Sally Ann. They were the perfect couple. They were like the Posh and Becks of Surrey. They had their moments. They were teenagers. They used to argue and bicker, but then who doesn't? Murder detectives were given the task of basically finding Lewis Sproston that afternoon. They managed to find him with a brother and a friend of his. He was approached by police officers asking him if he was Lewis Sproston. He said yes. And because he'd had a tiff with Sally that night and he'd driven off from the driveway, he said, oh, is this because we've had an argument? Immediately, alarm bells, I presume, went off. And they said, Lewis Sproston, you are being arrested for the murder of Sally Ann Bowman. And he had no idea. Here we had someone who had sort of acknowledged that he'd had some form of argument with Sally that night and literally put himself at the scene at the time of the murder. And
There is only one way to manage someone like that with an investigation, and that is to arrest them as a suspect for the murder, and that's what happened.
Lewis Sproston was taken into custody and questioned for 4 days. During this time, his DNA was taken, and the sample was sent for comparison with the DNA found on Sally Ann's body. But when the results came in, the news wasn't what the police were expecting.
It was a phone call from the Forensic Science Service, which basically said, Stuart, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we have a match to the DNA profile from your crime scene. The bad news is it matches to another crime, another sexual assault, 4 years before, only a mile and a half away in Purley.
This news ruled Lewis out as a suspect for Sally Ann's murder. But at the same time, the detectives' worst fears were realised. They were faced with a serial attacker, capable of murder, who could strike again at any time. Sally Ann was a talented singer who dreamt of performing at the Albert Hall, and she also enjoyed a successful modelling career.
Sally's modelling was her part-time job, something that she loved to do, always wanted to do from when she was little. Got the opportunity and took it with both hands, but that was just part of Sally. I don't know, they just portray her as the model Sally, wasn't her? Sally was Sally.
Happy-go-lucky, always laughing, giggling, singing. She wanted the fairy tale. She wanted to work hard, you know, be able to support herself financially. She then wanted the home, then the marriage, then the children. She just had this little thing that she just wanted to be known. She didn't want to be this big celebrity or anything else, just wanted to be known. And unfortunately now she's very known, but not in the way that she wanted.
Within hours of the murder, the family faced the awful task of formally identifying Sally Ann's body.
I went with Mum to go and identify Sally. I'll never forget, I just remember standing in the car park out the back, and you can hear them wheeling her through. And that thing just taking over, just wishing that it's not her. I remember going into the room, and for that split second, I thought it wasn't her, because her hair was dark. And then I moved forward, and you just see a little button nose and a little freckle. And that was it.
Part of me didn't want to look. I could feel Michelle behind me, and as I looked round, I just fell to pieces. My Sally laying there in a black zip-up body bag up to her neck. Hair all tied back off her head, where her hair had they'd washed the blood from her hair. And I see a tiny wound to her neck. And Michelle was just screaming and crying, asking me to wake her up, please wake her up, Mum. And it was just horrendous. But all I could do was touch the glass. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near my daughter. And all I wanted to do was hold her and kiss her, but we weren't allowed.
2 days later, Linda Bowman and her family made the difficult decision to learn for themselves exactly what had happened to Sally Ann.
It was DCI Stuart Cundy at the time. Came to the house with the liaison officer and another police officer. And he sat down and said that he was now going to answer all the questions that we had, and our questions were, how did Sally die? And they explained that Sally Ann had 10 entry and exit wounds to her body, where the blade of the knife was that long that it passed through her body completely. There were bite wounds to Sally Ann's body. And then Stuart looked at Nicole and said, in reply to your question, Nicole, yes, Sally Ann was raped. I just remember Nicole screaming, kicking, shouting, trying to calm her down. And then the words were, but after she was dead. That was just like someone hit me on the back of the head with a lump of wood. It was just pure disbelief that a human being could do that to a young girl that's laying dead on the floor. He took her last bit of dignity then.
Early in the investigation, Sally Ann's ex-boyfriend was the prime suspect for the murder, but he was ruled out when his DNA didn't match the DNA found on Sally Ann's body. What scientists did discover, though, was a forensic link between Sally Ann's killer and an unsolved crime that happened 4 years before the murder.
The attack from 2001 was another truly horrific sexual assault on a woman. A lady who was in a phone box making a phone call when the suspect walks over to her, tries to get into the phone box and masturbates over the phone box.
He manages to get the door open and then ejaculates over the floor of the phone box and then casually walks off across the car park of Tesco's away from her.
That remained an unsolved police investigation, despite the fact that DNA was obtained from that crime scene. And I say it's the dawning realisation that if the attacker has done that 4 years before, and then 4 years later murdered Sally in a truly horrific way, what has he done in that intervening period? And if he has brutally murdered Sally now, what might he do tonight? What might he do tomorrow?
As the investigation continued, detectives were shocked by a report of another attack just yards from the murder scene and only minutes before Sally Ann was killed.
This was a lone woman who was standing in the street on a mobile phone when she describes a lone male walking towards her who literally says, "I'm sorry," and then proceeds to hit her. And I think undoubtedly this suspect would have had done more in an attack were it not for a taxi that drives down Sanderstead Road and probably disturbs him. What he does do before he runs off is he grabs the lady's mobile phone, and she's still connected to the person that she was talking to.
That person can hear the victim screaming in the background. But what is very frightening and very chilling is that the sounds of the screams don't get any quieter.
Which suggests that lady's attacker, which we maintain, I believe, was Sally's murderer, is then hiding somewhere very close by, watching what is going on. And that victim is then taken by the taxi driver and taken away to hospital.
The victim from Sanderstead Road provided police with a detailed description of her attacker. And from this, detectives produced an e-fit of the offender, the same man who they were sure had also murdered Sally Ann less than an hour later.
He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's of proportionate build, with short, dark hair.
This e-fit was widely distributed, but despite the efforts of detectives and the number of calls from the public generated by the publicity, the breakthrough the police were desperate for never came. The murder squad went back to the DNA evidence found on Sally Ann's body to search for more clues.
We recovered DNA from Sally's body. Everything suggested that this murderer was local. In my mind, he was either going to live locally or he was staying locally that night of the murder. So in consultation with Croydon community and others, I made a decision very early on in the investigation that we would conduct an intelligence-led DNA screen. We had nearly 6,000 addresses that we wanted to ascertain every single male that lived in those premises or was there on the night of Sally's murder who might fit the description of her attacker. We anticipated that that was probably about 4,000 men of that description in the South Croydon area. So we took the innovative decision to basically set up a local DNA centre, which hadn't been done before, where we made the request of all the men in this locality to come to us to voluntarily give their DNA.
We knew fully well that the killer was not going to walk in and volunteer his DNA. But what there is this wider picture that maybe his dad or brother, and there can be a link with the DNA down the line.
We never, expected the murderer would come down and give his DNA, because if they did, then undoubtedly they are literally handing themselves into the police. But it did allow us to, as quickly as we could, disprove the other 99.9% of the population from South Croydon.
Despite being able to rule out a large number of local men, 6 months after the murder, the investigation seemed to be stalling. The police had the killer's DNA, they had a description of their prime suspect, and they even had evidence of links to a previous attack, but they were still no closer to identifying him.
There is an absolute fear, there is an absolute dread for many reasons. You have this offender's, this murderer's DNA profile. You know he's a serial attacker. He has attacked 2 females within a close time period, in a close proximity. He has murdered one of those. Why isn't that individual on our database? How are we going to catch him? How can we quickly catch him before he attacks again?
It was a not knowing who he was. It was a not knowing, you know, is he linked to the family in any way? Is it someone that we all know? Is it somebody we trusted? It was the fear of being in your homes at night, locking your windows, bolting your door, jumping every time there's a shadow or there's a noise. And from my point of view as a mum, is he going to get to another one of my girls? We had absolutely nothing other than DNA. That was all the police had, was DNA.
Faced with a stalling investigation, the police decided on a new line of inquiry. Just days after the killing, detectives had released an e-fit of the man who attacked a woman less than an hour before the murder. Police were sure that this attacker was the same man who would go on to kill Sally Ann. Now, though, they took the decision to release a second e-fit, this time of a man suspected of the attack in the phone box 4 years earlier.
The victim of the attack in 2001 hadn't completed an e-fit at the time of her attack. I took the decision that actually she might be able to add something more to our investigation, whilst undoubtedly the attacker and his image would still figure large in her mind. We could never be totally sure that the image which she created was indeed what the attacker looked like at that time, and if it was accurate, it was what he looked like 4 years before. But I took the choice, let's release it. We can use this to generate another round of significant publicity. So in March 2006, I released the second e-fit.
After discussions with Sally Ann's family, the police also decided to release some of the more horrific details about the nature of the murder itself.
It was absolutely imperative that everybody out there, particularly people in South Croydon, knew the level of dangerousness that this murderer posed.
We did a television appeal, and I remember thinking any minute he's going to say it, and I could just feel my heart pounding.
The decision was taken that I would tell the media and we would be publicly talking about the fact that Sally, we did believe that she was raped after she had been murdered.
And that was it. It was all out there. Everybody knew.
These revelations brought new leads, but they too were dead ends. Police were still nowhere near catching Sally Ann's killer. All that was to change, however, with a seemingly unrelated event 20 miles away from the murder site involving a 35-year-old local man called Mark Dixie.
We believe Mark Dixie was at one of the local pubs in Crawley watching the England Trinidad and Tobago World Cup game. He'd clearly consumed some alcohol. He'd got in an argument with another male. This argument spilled out onto the street and was seen by a police officer outside pushing this victim to the floor. Luckily for us, luckily for the murder inquiry, the officer reacted immediately and he was arrested and taken to Crawley Police Station.
The officer that dealt with the investigation of the assault in Sussex was surprised how Mark Dixie behaved when they were in police custody, particularly when he was being interviewed. They described him as being quite tearful, which they were surprised about because it was a relatively minor case where he'd pushed somebody over. But they didn't quite know why, couldn't quite put their finger on it. And once he'd been interviewed, provided his DNA and his fingerprints, he was bailed from police custody. With hindsight looking back, he was probably tearful because this was the point in his life where literally everything came on top for him, and he knew full well that now his DNA had been taken, he would be linked directly to the murder of Sally Ann.
12 days later, the murder squad received the news that would break the case wide open, confirming that the DNA found on Sally Ann matched that of Mark Dixie.
We received an email from the laboratory that we had actually a DNA hit identifying our offender, who we believed was our murderer.
When the call comes in, setting aside that short-lived feeling of elation, the big question then presents itself, well, where is he?
It would later emerge that Mark Dixie had fled to Amsterdam for 3 months in an effort to evade the manhunt. Luckily for detectives, an argument with his landlord meant Dixie returned to the UK in January 2006.
Mark Dixie had gone back to his job as a chef in a pub in Hawley, had still remained working there. Why? I'm not entirely sure, but I probably believe that Mark Dixie, who was an arrogant individual, had got away with multiple offending throughout his life, had probably felt when he was bailed from Crawley Police Station that he had got away with the murder.
When he was arrested for the fight, Mark Dixie had given the location of the pub where he worked as his home address. Armed with this information, detectives sprang into action.
We didn't know much about Mark Dixie at this stage. We didn't know if he had any friends, whether he was likely to get assistance from anybody in the pub to evade our arrest. But at an early stage, we identified that he was working at that time in the kitchen.
Police quickly devised a plan to arrest their prime suspect.
It was whilst this plan was taking place, we were walking through the car park at the back of the pub, walking to one of the side entrances, and that is when we realised we've identified Mark Dixie, we've had his photograph, we knew what he looked like, and that's when we immediately arrested him. It was during that arrest I actually put my hand, across his chest to make sure that he didn't run away. I could feel his heartbeat, and his heartbeat didn't even change. I had expected, some form of reaction from him, but I think it really just went to show what a chilling, detached individual Mark Dixie is.
Dixie was charged with the murder the following day. The next move for the police was to inform Sally Ann's relatives of the breakthrough.
The family liaison officer immediately went round to Linda's address. It's not something we would ever want to do on the phone if we could avoid it, and therefore it was always going to be a personal message from the family liaison officer to Linda and her family.
When I rang Linda out of the blue that night, which would have been about 9 o'clock from memory, and said, I need to come and see you. She said, well, I said, Linda, I just need to come and see you. And she said, oh, you've caught him. I said, Linda, I just need to come and see you. Please make sure you're available. So I drove there, she opened the door, and she said, you've caught him, haven't you?
And they said, just take a seat, just sit down. I went, you've got him. So I sat down, and I could feel myself trembling. And they said, yes, we have arrested someone. He said, I have the picture of the person that murdered, that we believe, the suspect murdered Sally Ann. And he went to a picture there, and I had to stop him. I wasn't ready. This side wanted to see it, but this side I was petrified it was going to be someone I knew. After a few seconds, I composed myself, and I opened it. And just saw these big, ugly, bulging eyes and this horrible face, and it was someone I didn't know. It didn't make it any easier, to be honest.
With the prime suspect locked up, detectives began the task of finding out exactly who Mark Dixie was and how he evaded the police for so long.
Mark Dixie was born in 1970. He lived in Streatham for a number of years before he moved to a children's home in Sidcup. He'd been arrested by police for a number of assaults on police, robbery offences. But at an early stage, he went abroad. Throughout the years, he'd lived in Australia for a number of years. and had also moved to Europe and in particular Spain before moving back to this country.
Crucially, all Mark Dixie's prior offences took place before offenders were required to provide a DNA sample, allowing him to go unnoticed by the authorities.
He is a monster of an individual that has clearly led a double life. He's been able to submerge himself in normal society, pass himself off between friends and family as a normal individual. And I believe whilst he's been outside normal relationships, has committed horrific offences, committed attempted murders, sexual assaults, rapes of young females.
We charged Mark Dixie on the 28th of June. Again, he gave no reply to when he was charged. In fact, the only thing he'd ever said was when he first brought to the police station, when he was being booked into the custody sergeant, he made probably a throwaway but a telling comment, which was, "I must have been mad to have done that."
With Dixie in custody, the detective's job wasn't finished. In fact, it was just beginning. They would spend the next 18 months unravelling Mark Dixie's movements leading up to the murder to try and explain how and why he'd killed Sally Ann Bowman.
Huge amounts of effort was put into tracking down his associates, his friends, to try and build a picture of who he was. The 24th of September is his birthday. He'd gone with friends to a pub in the Brighton Road, a few, 100 yards from Blenheim Crescent, where, as they often described him, he was often the life and soul of the party. Indeed, he was that night. He'd had a fair amount to drink, he'd taken some coke, but they didn't describe him as being overly intoxicated. One of the things which we were able to establish around Mark Dixie and his birthday was that birthdays were a significant event for him. And his partners described that he always expected something significant for his birthday. And on that day in 2005, his partner at that point in time hadn't gone out with him for his birthday. He spoke to her on the phone whilst he was in the pub with the others, and his associates, his acquaintances, do describe him coming back after that phone call as a different Mark. He was no longer that bubbly life and soul individual. He was a lot more subdued, potentially angry.
Dixie spent the rest of the evening consuming a large amount of alcohol, as well as 2 lines of cocaine. At closing time, he left the pub with 2 female friends.
He went back to stay at a friend's house to the women in Avondale Road, a few hundred yards from Blenheim Crescent. We think they went to bed probably in the early hours of the morning, and therefore at some point, probably from about 2:30 onwards, he leaves that flat and goes out. And what I believe happened is he took a knife from that flat with him. Whether it was one of his own knives, he was a chef, we just don't know. But I'm convinced he went out of that flat with the intention of finding a woman, attacking her and raping her. I think his first victim was the lady in Sanderstead Road. I think that he felt he'd failed with that attack because the taxi drivers disturbed them and he's had to run away. And that's when he's ended up in Blenheim Crescent. I think that has literally resulted in poor Sally being exactly at the wrong place at the wrong time. She would have been overpowered incredibly quickly. Mark Dixie has then savagely murdered her. He's then quickly left that murder scene, maybe only a matter of yards, we don't know, and has basically watched and waited to see if any of the neighbours have come out of the houses. No bedroom light goes on or anything like that. Of course, what he doesn't know is that there is a witness, one of the neighbours, who is looking out of their bedroom without the bedroom light on. And what she describes as a man walking down the pavement back to where Sally's body was eventually found. I'm absolutely convinced that is Mark Dixie.
Assuming he wasn't being watched, Mark Dixie returned to Sally Ann's body and raped her.
He clearly at some point then, once he's raped Sally, goes back to where he was staying that night in Avondale Road, goes to sleep on the sofa, and when he and his friends wake up in the morning, he behaves as if nothing has happened. And I think that really sums up in my mind what Mark Dixie is like. A callous nature and someone who has carried it off like this for most of his life.
This cold-hearted detachment was never more evident than when Mark Dixie arrived at the Old Bailey on the 5th of February 2008. His description of what he did the night of Sally Ann's murder would shock everyone who heard it.
When we first went into the courtroom at the Old Bailey, the murderer was already in the box. And we were less than 3 foot away from him. And I could feel him staring round, looking round.
Mark Dixie's defence was that he wasn't the murderer. There was another murderer still unarrested, undetected, but he was the rapist, that he came across what he believed was a drunk girl laying unconscious in the street on the driveway, and he thought he'd seize his opportunity to have sex with her.
When he was telling this to the court and the jury, with Sally's family listening, it really, with so much, and this is my phrase, so much contempt, as if to say, well, what's wrong with doing that?
Throughout the trial, the cold-hearted Mark Dixie never once offered any explanation for why he had murdered Sally Ann.
I remember watching him. He had no remorse on his face. He didn't care what he'd done. It was like, it was pleasure for him to see that we're all sitting there hurting. He didn't care. He just wanted to see us squirm while we sat there and listened to what he had to say. He's an animal.
As part of their investigations into the murder in the lead-up to the trial, detectives began to uncover a trail of attacks that stretched across the globe. The trail led back to one man, Mark Dixie.
We immediately realised that he had travelled to Australia, and we submitted again the DNA profile to Australia, saying that we identified our murder offender. And it was Western Australia that came back to us and said, yes, they have a hit for that DNA profile for an attack on a lone female in a house in Perth, Western Australia in 1998. It was around about midnight. She was studying alone when she heard a noise coming from the kitchen. She goes to investigate and sees what we know is Mark Dixie coming through the kitchen window with what looked like a stocking over his head, armed with a knife. And the next thing she knows, she's actually being stabbed. She's rendered unconscious. She received 7 stab wounds, very similar to that of Sally Ann. She was extremely lucky to live. We know she's raped while she's unconscious, and a number of her personal items were stolen by Dixie, which we believe were potentially used as trophies by him.
The trial of Mark Dixie lasted 3 weeks, and the tension in the court before the verdict was delivered was unbearable.
When the foreperson did stand up and they told the court that they had found Mark Dixie guilty and it was a unanimous verdict, the feelings for each of us privately will all be quite personal and undoubtedly all different in many ways. From the police officers' perspectives, not a feeling, but a myriad of feelings of, yeah, we got him. We got him.
And I just thought, you know what? That's it. She can finally rest now. That part of the journey's over. He's been caught and he's been found guilty. But it's not a relief because you can't have it back.
Mark Dixie was sentenced to mandatory life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 34 years for the murder of Sally Ann Bowman.
He will be at the earliest in his 70s when he's released from prison, and that's the absolute earliest. It's a significant sentence. His dangerousness was acknowledged by the judge, and a sentence like that does reflect the need to protect society from Mark Dixie and individuals such as him.
A prison sentence, however, no matter how long, was not enough for Sally Ann's relatives.
Justice will never be done. Never. Not the whole time that man's living. It will never, ever be done. He's fine. He's got himself a nice little cell, cosied up in there. So what justice is that for Sally? She's not here. She's in a hole. She's not with her family, where she belongs. All because he felt that he had the right to take her from us.
Mark Dixie is a detached, arrogant monster who is a danger to the public. He's probably one of the most frightening individuals that I've had the opportunity to deal with in my police career.
Do I have any feelings for Mark Dixie? If I'm honest, no, I don't. Mark Dixie is someone that I don't want to spend any energy having feelings about. My feelings are for those that he's affected throughout his life, Linda and her family, his other victims.
Due to the crucial role played by DNA in the case, Linda Bowman is now a firm advocate of a compulsory national DNA database.
My reasons for sort of trying to campaign as such in my own little world for national DNA database, I don't see any deterrents, even 6 years on, that have been put in place. Politicians all have these bright ideas. Well, my deterrent is the biggest deterrent I could ever think of. Take DNA from birth. What's the problem with putting that onto a national database for everybody? DNA does protect the innocent, because if DNA was not found on Sally Ann belonging to her killer, then Lewis would undoubtedly right now be serving a 34-year sentence for her murder. I think about Sally every 5 seconds of the day, 7 days a week. I walk around the house and I look at the bedroom and, you know, I see her clothes. I've got some of her clothes hanging up my wardrobe, her pillows laying on my bed that I sleep with every night.
You get that split second in the morning when you wake up and your life is perfect. Everything's how you want it to be. And then, bang, it's there and it hits you. Worrying to close your eyes, not knowing what you're going to see, not knowing if you're going to see that Sally that you remember or that Sally you see from the pictures. And that fear goes through me every night when I go to sleep. The nightmares don't ever stop. Just the ones where you just wanting to get to her and there's nothing you can do.
There's constant reminders, and there's days where I sit and think of her and I have a huge smile on my face and I think of some of the funny things and practical jokes she's played. And then there's days I just want to shut myself away from the whole world and pretend it's not happened and she's just having a long holiday. I think to myself, if she could talk to us, to me, her dad and her sister, she'd probably just say, "Mum, I want my life back. Mum, I want to come home." But it's never going to happen, is it?
The animal hasn't just taken Sally, but he's taken a piece of all of us. And he's taken a bigger piece from my mum, who were never meant.
There is just one story this morning, the dramatic end of the Gorbachev era in the Soviet Union.
She was one of Britain's most high-profile television presenters at the pinnacle of her career when she was shot down in cold blood outside her house in London.
Felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
He went right up to her, pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
More than 2 decades on, the murder of Jill Dando remains a mystery.
Could be almost anyone, we just don't know who he is.
On the 26th of April 1999, BBC television presenter Jill Dando was shot by a single bullet to the head on the doorstep of her home in southwest London. The hunt for her killer prompted the biggest murder inquiry ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police. 2 years later, after a controversial court case, local resident Barry George was found guilty of the killing. But during a dramatic retrial, he was cleared of Jill Dando's murder. So who shot one of Britain's best-loved television personalities? This is the story of the brutal slaying of Jill Dando, told from the inside through the eyewitness accounts from those closest to the story. Born in Weston-super-Mare, Jill Dando began her journalism career as a reporter on the local paper, the Western Mercury. Determined to work in broadcasting, she eventually went on to become a presenter for BBC South West. She quickly rose to become a household name when she moved to the BBC's national news operation in London, presenting the breakfast news and the 6 o'clock news. But she was best known as the face of the hit shows Holiday and Crime Watch, a series that explored unsolved criminal investigations. Above all, Jill Dando was renowned for her down-to-earth charm that endeared her to millions of viewers.
Didn't matter whether she was doing Crime Watch or the news or the holiday programme and the other things she did. She had a warmth and sincerity about her, which is not really something you can learn. It's just the way you are. And I think Jill had that connection with the public that made them feel like she was their sister or their auntie and part of their family.
Jill Dando was one of the most popular people on television. She was kind of a darling of the BBC. She presented mainstream programmes like Holiday and Crime Watch, and she had a really, I guess, very pleasing personality that people really responded to. She was, people felt that when she was presenting programmes as if she was talking to them through the screen, and that was a great gift that she had.
When she moved to Fulham, she lived in the next road to where I live, and we would always bump into each other in the local shops, in the street, and that's how we would chat and catch up.
She was great fun, had a fabulous sense of humour, but very serious and professional when she needed to be, and she was just a great person to be around. Throughout, certainly my years on Crime Watch, it was always a very close-knit team, and Jill fitted into that perfectly.
It was another young woman who was going to be the face of Britain at the millennium. So she was the embodiment, in a sense, of the BBC.
As well as enjoying a successful TV career, Jill had recently announced her engagement to Dr. Alan Farthing.
She was getting married, she was talking about Alan and the wedding and getting excited about organising everything, and she had so much to look forward to, so much fun, happiness in her life.
I remember bumping into her when she came back from Sydney, when she'd been on holiday, and she was totally in love.
The pair had met on a blind date at a dinner party in 1997. They became engaged in February 1999 and were due to marry that same year. To her friends and colleagues, Jill was as happy as she'd ever been, and she shared with them her desire to become a mother. On the 26th of April 1999, Jill Dando had spent the night at Alan Farthing's home in Chiswick.
Jill left her fiancé's house in Chiswick. I think it was about 7 or 8 in the morning. The plan was that she would go from the house to, I think she had a fashion shoot at lunchtime, a job she was doing, and then in the afternoon she was planning to go to a fitting for her wedding dress.
Miss Dando had been going to her house purely to get changed. She was no longer living there. She was living with a boyfriend several miles away.
Jill lived on Gowan Avenue in Fulham, southwest London.
So Gowan Avenue, typical residential street, quite middle class, lots of comings and goings, a typical morning, a very ordinary morning, nothing unexpected appeared to be going on. People taking their children to school, the postman coming down the road, neighbours coming and going.
When she bought her home in Fulham and was so thrilled about it, she told me that one of the reasons she'd chosen that home was that it had a hedge and it had a tree that afforded her privacy.
Having left her fiancé's home in Chiswick, Jill made various stops on her way home, including a brief visit to the petrol station, Kingsmall shopping centre in Hammersmith, and a fishmonger's on Fulham Road. It was around 11:30 a.m. when Jill finally arrived at Gowan Avenue.
She got out of her car, having parked it, and in fact, still had the keys to the car in her hand.
As Jill was about to approach her front door, she was unaware that somebody was closely watching her every movement. As she looked for her house keys in her bag, she was approached from behind and shot once in the head.
It was very unusual to see Jill's car parked in the road because she was living with her fiancé in Chiswick at that point. I thought, oh, I might see Jill as she comes out of her front door. So as I approached her home, I deliberately looked at her front door, and there's a very tiny pathway from the pavement where I was to her front door, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
What it seemed to have happened was that Jill Dando had gone to her home address, albeit she wasn't living there anymore, and it would seem that she was attacked and shot effectively on a doorstep just prior to entering her house.
It was a ruthless murder. It wasn't done, the shooting wasn't from a distance, the killer wasn't standing at the gate, he wasn't sort of leaning out of a car, he went right up to her, pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
There was no time to prepare. From one step to the next, everything changed because I was witness to an incredibly violent scene. At first, it was difficult in the first few seconds to realise it was actually Jill, and she was actually in that position on her doorstep, leaning against her front door. She had changed colour, there was a lot of blood loss, and instinctively, it was clear to me that she was dead. I looked around, there was nobody else in the street, and I quickly got my mobile phone to call the emergency services. When I was talking to the emergency services, I said that I thought that she had been stabbed because of the blood loss. It didn't occur to me at that point that it would have been a gun crime. And I added in the conversation, confidentially, it's Jill Dando.
Shocked and distressed, Helen didn't want to be alone.
I remember that I'd seen a neighbour who lives near me. So I ran down the road and knocked on the person's door. My neighbour came to the scene. She took one look and said, she looks as if she's dead, and ran off further up the road to a doctor's surgery. So I was left on my own again at the scene looking at Jill, who was lifeless on her own doorstep.
The police were first to arrive.
They just went through the gate and started dealing with Jill. They pretty quickly bundled me and the other two, the doctor's receptionist and my neighbour, into Jill's neighbour's home.
Soon after, the paramedics arrived, and then the air ambulance. Jill Dando was taken to Charing Cross Hospital.
She was certified dead at 1:03 p.m.
The BBC television presenter Jill Dando has been murdered outside her London home.
A man was seen leaving from outside number 29 Gowan Avenue, and he ran east down this road towards the Fulham Palace Road.
Detectives are now trying to establish a motive for the murder. Our correspondent Fergus Walsh.
I felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
In this country, although there are a lot of shootings, they're usually linked to the underworld, crime gangs, teenage gangs. But a lady like this, shot on a doorstep in a West London street, a nice West London street, very respectable, quite well-heeled, was extraordinary.
The image that really is very, very difficult is her beautiful engagement ring with all that hope in it. on a very dead hand, just snuffed out.
Scotland Yard launched into action with Operation Oxborough, the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper.
Regardless of who the victim is, there needs to be a methodical approach to the inquiry. It was just because of the victim, in this case, being such a high-profile celebrity, that everything was increased. For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
Also important to put this in some perspective, because the London police were on the alert searching for the now bomber, David Copeland. And so there was a huge amount of police activity around London and a lot of news media concentration on that issue, because there'd already been 2 now bombs, one in Brick Lane, one in Brixton, and there was a great deal of concern about where this now bomber was going to strike again and what the reaction would be.
With unprecedented media attention surrounding the police investigation and the victim's high-profile status, the homicide squad came under immense public scrutiny. They faced their first hurdle with a forensic examination of the crime scene.
Yeah, one of the main problems that the police had was that it had been quite severely compromised by the medical services that had been there, by them removing her body once it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done, created some problems. Very little was obtained from that scene. What they had done, I can't criticise that, because I assumed that everything was being done to try and save Miss Dando's life at the time.
There was nothing that came out from the scene other than the fact they, of course, had the bullet which had killed Jill Dando, which was quite unusual. It was crimped, it had been pressed in. They used 50 search officers going down the surrounding streets, and they took up the drains, they looked at the sewers, they looked all along the riverbank by the park in case that the government might just have tossed the gun over a hedge or threw it into a drain.
We can't be sure, obviously, about the gun that was used because it's never been recovered. But the thinking was that it was in some way a reactivated gun, or one that had in some way been adapted.
After the forensic examination of the crime scene proved fruitless, the detectives turned their attention to examining witness statements.
There was no eyewitness to the actual offence. Several witnesses gave information about a man who was present at the scene before and immediately after, and one of the main focuses of the inquiry was to identify this person.
Richard, her neighbour, said that he had heard her set her car alarm and that he had heard a scream, looked out of the window, and he'd seen somebody go past further down Gowan Avenue.
One of the problems that the team was faced with was the unprecedented amount of information that was being received within the incident room. During the course of the inquiry, over 2,000 people were named as being responsible or in some way involved in Miss Dando's murder. Without a clear witness or without a clear motive and reason, stranger murders are by definition the most difficult to investigate.
In a cruel twist of fate, detectives turned to the very programme Jill had presented in a bid to find her killer.
You never imagine in your wildest dreams the idea that you would ever have, or we would ever have had to make an appeal about somebody we knew so well. There was a pressure on us to think that we could do something to help, to use the programme and to use our experience to try and help in some way. And I think everyone was actually really relieved that they could feel that they could do something. The appeal itself to find information regarding Jill's killer produced a lot of phone calls.
Several witnesses saw a man in the area earlier in the morning. And then there are various sightings of a man in a sort of waxed jacket. We have somebody who saw what they described as a sweating man at a bus stop. We have another sweating man seen in Fulham Palace Park, or Fulham Park, which is opposite, quite close to Gowan Avenue, who was talking on a mobile phone. So there are lots of different little sort of sightings, but nobody actually saw the attack.
One of the main purposes of the inquiry is to try and separate the potential suspect from other people.
And I think as the months went on, it was quite apparent that this was going to be a long investigation.
As the police inquiry continued, the funeral of Jill Dando took place at Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare. Mourners lined the streets to watch the 3-mile cortege.
I was not able to attend Jill's funeral. I did go to her Thanksgiving at All Souls in Langham Place, which was like the funeral for me. And I can remember trying not to cry at that, because it was definitely a Thanksgiving for her life.
A grieving nation mounted pressure on the police to bring Jill's killer to justice.
What we needed to be sure of, was she followed, wasn't she followed? There was a small and dedicated group of officers that meticulously went through every scrap of footage that we had during the course of the inquiry. What we can categorically say is that from the meticulous examination of the footage from 191 cameras, she wasn't followed at all to that address.
They also searched through 80,000 mobile phone records for the Fulham area and also for Chiswick, which could in some way be linked to her death. Either somebody following her who passed on a message that she was on her way home, or somebody who was waiting and got the message that she was arriving. None of those phone calls produced any evidence either.
The months rolled by, but no leads emerged, and police were struggling to gather any significant evidence.
Her file of facts had 486 names in it, and they went through every name and address they could find. They looked at her fiancé's background and drew a blank on that.
I realised that on day one, I was probably on a list of potential suspects being first on the scene. That's a normal thing. The nearest and dearest of a victim are always scrutinised, and I knew that I would be too.
Because of the nature of who Miss Dando was and her work, it was hard to ascertain a definitive motive as to why someone would conceivably want to kill her.
Obviously, one of the lines of inquiry was the possibility that there had been a stalker or somebody with an unhealthy interest in Jill Dando who might have come along and killed her.
Like a lot of celebrities, she'd attracted a lot of unhealthy interest. They found, for example, that one man had tried to acquire her BT account and run it unknown to her, but which would allow him to look at her phone calls or phone numbers. They found that somebody else had 150 pictures on his, of her collected on his computer. Another man had attempted to take over her utility bills, electricity, gas, water. Extraordinary behaviour by some of these people. But the police looked at about 4,000 people, I think it was, of whom about 150 seemed to have what they would describe as an unhealthy interest in her. But at the end of the day, none of these had showed any evidence of taking their interest further than a fantasy or a fixation. George had a conviction for a sex attack in the 1980s. He also discovered that there was a reference on his file to the fact he'd been arrested in the grounds of one of the royal palaces with a length of rope around his shoulder and a knife. And the palace concern was the one where the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana were then living. And they found that he'd been stopped by police in the 1990s for following women. Nobody at Fulham Police Station actually knew anything about him, interestingly. Barry George turned out to be a very long way down the suspect list.
He was described as a loner. And he was almost a usual, one of the usual suspects, because the police hadn't found anybody and they came back to him.
Barry George had been reported to the police in the early days following Jill's murder.
Detective Constable called John Gallagher discovered a message about a man called Busara, which had come in from Hafad, which was a local drop-in centre for disabled people, very close to the scene of the shooting, in which they said that this man, Busara, had seemed very agitated and they were concerned about him. The policeman did some checking and found that Busara cross-referred to Barry George.
Barry George often claimed he was the cousin of British musician Freddie Mercury and used the alias Barry Bulsara.
To some extent, he was living in a fantasy world, especially in relation to Queen and music and all the rest of it. But this is it. It was an overtly fantastical world where, he wasn't hiding away.
He pretended that he was the cousin of the singer or the musician in the Electric Light Orchestra, that his name was Paul Gadd, which is in fact the real name of Gary Glitter. And he had a name, Steve Majors, that he also used. And he pretended he was in the SAS, and that seems to have been an amalgam of Lee Majors, the actor, and Steve Austin, the $6 million man from the television programme. So because of all these different names, and because many of the people had phoned in to the police about him anonymously and not giving a name, it took the police several months to connect all these incidents and realise that they were all sightings of the same person.
I think most people who lived in Fulham were aware of Barry George wandering around the streets. He's quite distinctive. He was somebody who probably needed a little bit more help than he had in the community.
But further examination of statements given to police during the early days of the investigation began to reveal more.
By now, police were getting very concerned because they also knew, looking through their records, that a local taxi firm had also called the police soon after the shooting to say they were concerned about a man who kept coming in and seemed to be trying to build up what, as it appeared to the police, to be constructing an alibi for himself.
Timings were crucial, of course, because the killing took place at around 11:30 in the morning. Question, where was he? And his case was that he'd attended at a local agency, Hafad, housing agency, and that he'd gone home and changed clothing, and he'd gone to a park and gone to get a taxi somewhere else. And so his defensive alibi was that he wasn't in the road when it happened.
An investigation into his past revealed that Barry George had a history of unusual behaviour. He suffered from a personality disorder, had a fixation with celebrities, and was known locally to follow and photograph women.
There was one case of, I think it was a woman in a bus queue, and then he got on the bus with her. Now, this is very overt behaviour. In other words, it is somebody who is, I think, desperately anxious to create a relationship, which he hasn't got, with somebody. And so it's an unhappy situation, and it's very unpleasant, I suspect, for any woman who is on the receiving end of this treatment. And in a sense, he needs help if that's what was going on. But this is a long way away from the nature of this crime, which wasn't about following Jill Dando around in order to create a relationship.
The psychological profilers were talking about somebody who might well fantasize, who might, for example, have fantasized over Princess Diana, somebody who'd had difficult relationships in the past, which Barry George had had. All of these things added to the list of things that ticked off that made him a very strong suspect, and then eventually the strongest suspect.
More than 12 months on from Jill's murder, the Metropolitan Police arrested Barry George at his flat.
4 unarmed officers, or that is what Scotland Yard still maintains, arrested him, and they began a search of his home. And that is when things became interesting.
No, I mean, Barry George's flat was absolutely stacked to the ceiling with old newspapers. You could barely get in it. So he, again, might be regarded as an oddball for keeping all these newspaper cuttings and so on. But, so, yes, there was a sort of obsessive side to this man because he collected things, but I know lots of people who collect things. Maybe not to that extent. Obsessive of Jill Dando? Absolutely not. You know, you would think that if he was obsessed with Jill Dando, he would have accumulated quite a library, because she was in the newspapers very regularly. None of it was cut out, none of it was highlighted. There were no notes anywhere suggesting he was wanting to find out where Jill Dando was at any one time.
They took a coat that he'd worn and sent it for examination. They developed about 100 reels of film which he had, which showed that he'd been stalking around about, I think it's 480 women.
The police investigation also revealed that he had an interest in firearms. Barry George was interviewed at Hammersmith Police Station in London.
This is a man who originally had told the police that he had nothing to do with guns and hadn't had anything to do with guns for quite a long time. But police found that, for example, he tried to join the parachute regiment, the TA section of it. He tried to join the regular army. He belonged for a short time to a gun club in Kensington. He'd had a number of starter pistols. A former neighbour of his had seen him with a weapon.
After he was arrested, it was plain he did have an interest in firearms. I mean, he didn't have the weapon that is said to have been used here, but he did have an interest in weapons. But that doesn't mean that he's the murderer.
He said he had nothing to do with Jill Dando. He didn't know Jill Dando lived in the area. He'd never met her, never seen her, and denied any link at all to the murder.
Barry George was asked to take part in an ID parade.
He refused to go on an ID parade, and so the ID parades were done on a laptop with potential witnesses being shown a series of images of possible suspects plus innocent people, and picking them out from a laptop display.
There was a neighbour living right next door to Jill Dando who was looking out on the road, and a man living opposite. They both saw somebody departing from the gate area where this had happened. And they both went to identification parades, and neither of them picked out Barry George. In fact, either one or both picked out someone else.
Whilst Barry George was being held in custody, forensics made a discovery that would change the course of the investigation.
Everything gelled for the police when they were told by the forensic science experts that they had found a very, very tiny trace of firearms discharge in the pocket of the coat that had been taken away. It was said to measure around about 0.5 of an inch. It was tiny.
Remember, we're talking about a year after the shooting, and it matched the firearms residue at the scene.
But the interesting thing about it was that the chemical composition, according to the scientists, was exactly the same as the bullet which had killed Jill Dando.
They also found a single fibre at the crime scene that matched the material on a pair of trousers owned by prime suspect Barry George. On the 29th of May 2000, Barry George was formally charged with the murder of Jill Dando.
There was a lot of press interest in him. Obviously, because identification was a key issue in the case, and the police were very keen that lots of pictures of him didn't appear. And that was slightly odd because at the very beginning of the trial, the court then gave permission for pictures to be released, and there was this huge amount of coverage about him at the start of the trial, all these different images of him, and it was considered that was quite sort of prejudicial towards him, really.
Barry George's trial for the murder of Jill Dando got underway at the Old Bailey in February 2001. It was a trial that would captivate the nation and prove to be one of the most controversial cases in British criminal history. He pleaded not guilty.
A trial at the Old Bailey for anyone is a pressured event, especially if it's in one of the old courts, which it was, because they've held many famous trials. Certainly most of the UK press and media were there on a daily basis. So the court was full of people interested in the result.
During the trial, the prosecution presented George as a lone gunman with stalker tendencies. But his defence counsel painted a different picture.
We tried to present Barry George, obviously as the person that he was, just very vulnerable person, living in the locality, relatively well known in the locality, who had an alibi, which he'd obviously produced to the jury, and basically as somebody who, in a sense, wasn't capable of carrying out this murder.
The case against Barry George centred on forensic evidence.
The gun residue was clearly the key issue because it linked, according to the prosecution, it directly linked Barry George to a gun, to the murder.
You have to remember, no firearms residue was found in his flat or found in anything else to do with him. So if he's supposed to be adapting weapons or playing around with weapons, where was he doing it? He certainly wasn't doing it in his flat. He didn't own lots of flats all over London. One had to examine the possibility that it had got there through an accident of continuity. In other words, it was contamination.
The prosecution relied heavily on the identification evidence. They relied on a fibre which they found, which they said linked Barry George's trouser to Jill Dando, that the fibre had come off the trousers and onto her clothing.
This case depended largely on circumstantial evidence. And plainly, from a prosecution point of view, forensic scientific evidence can be rather more compelling than any other.
It was circumstantial, and they admitted it was circumstantial, but the judge and the prosecution both said that it was possible to convict on the basis of circumstantial evidence without, for example, a confession, without an eyewitness who had actually seen a gun used, without the gun itself, without a motive.
After a trial lasting 5 weeks, a jury of 6 women and 5 men found Barry George guilty of the murder of Jill Dando, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
I was very upset, I was very angry, the fact that he'd been convicted. I had plenty of time to think back over the trial and say, well, what's gone wrong here? How did this jury come to that conclusion? I think it's probably a combination of somebody who kind of looked odd in the dock, somebody who looked odd, which fitted the publicity that had gone before. Secondly, I think there was pressure on this jury, feeling that the nature of the crime was so heinous that, you know, here was an odd man and he lived in the area and there was a firearms particle. And they put that together, I think.
Despite the verdict, Barry George always protested his innocence. And as he began his sentence, there was growing unease at the decision to find him guilty.
From that point on, people began to get behind Barry George, to campaign for a fresh look at the case, and arguing that there was something wrong here, that it was a miscarriage of justice. His defence managed to mount an appeal. As the years went on and Barry George remained in prison, a campaign built up to get him free.
Eventually, new forensic research cast doubt over the significance of the gunpowder traces used to initially convict George, and the case went to a retrial.
The Court of Appeal had argued that if the evidence in the pocket had been found a day or so after the murder, then it was key evidence. There was a link. But because there had been such a long period of time, it was no longer safe to assume it was linked to the murder.
The forensic evidence was deemed unsafe, and after 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally cleared of the murder of Jill Dando.
The prosecution maintained that he was an obsessionist with a fantasy about guns and a grudge against the BBC. The defence simply said, what we have here is the police have arrested the local nutter. And that was the phrase used by William Clegg QC, who now appeared for Barry George. And the jury accepted that there wasn't sufficient evidence.
Because I'm a firm believer that the truth will out in the end and justice will be done, but some people have to wait far longer than he did. And to give him his due, it's his persistence, his self-belief that got him acquitted.
It all comes back to why was she actually attacked? Whoever did it had to know she lived there. Whoever did it took steps to make sure that nobody tried to stop them leaving. Had to have had a weapon which they had loaded and ready to use.
I mean, I believed throughout the case, because of the nature of the evidence and the window of opportunity, it had to have been carried out by a professional.
Some theories linked Jill's murder to her job as presenter of Crime Watch.
So there were a number of theories that emerged in the aftermath of Barry George's acquittal. And I guess into this vacuum, all these theories came. And one of them was that Jill could have been shot by the IRA. And I think that has its origins in somebody in a prison cell saying that they'd heard this story, that because of her Crime Watch association, that somehow or other the IRA were concerned that she might identify some members, and so that they had, put out a hit on her, as it were. That was very similar to the suggestion of a North London crime family who also was said to have been outraged by her interest, or Crime Watch's interest, in their activities. And so it was suggested that they too had put out a hit on her. Maybe those theories have some weight, but the police would have investigated them.
Another theory mentioned by Barry George's legal team suggested that Jill Dando may have been assassinated by a Serbian hitman.
There was the possibility that her death had been linked to the Kosovan War, because she made an appeal on behalf of the Kosovans, and a few days before, the Belgrade TV station used by the Serbs had been bombed by the NATO allies, and this could be a tit for tat.
I know that there was another theory in relation to her death which seemed to have gained some credence on social media, that she had been investigating a VIP paedophile ring, or had been told about the existence of such a ring of people, and that had prompted her investigation, and that the ring had conspired to kill her so that they wouldn't be exposed by her inquiries.
There wasn't a clear explanation. It wasn't a sex attack, it wasn't a robbery. It was an assassination of some description, and that left people very, very puzzled.
The fact remains that Jill Dando's next-door neighbour looked out of the window after what was the shooting and saw somebody leaving, closing her front gate and setting off down the road. So this person could be anyone. He could be the hitman from the North London crime family. He could be the IRA assassin. He could be the Serbian hitman who's been sent over from Belgrade. Could be almost anyone. We just don't know who he is.
What we were all conscious of throughout the inquiry was what a senseless crime this was. And the feeling of shock, to a degree, throughout the country never really diminished.
My own view is that the person who was responsible was the person that was seen in the street multiple times that day, who has never been identified. And I think it's highly unlikely that they were a hired assassin or a contract killer. I think it was, the stalker, loner, obsessive type person who had an interest in guns, who had an interest in television, celebrities. They don't have any connection to Jill Dando, probably, and therefore it's going to be incredibly hard to identify them.
More than 2 decades on from her murder, Jill's legacy lives on with her friends and colleagues.
Jill Dando's name will live on because the BBC founded a scholarship for her, in her name, for a young media trainee, And there is an Institute of Criminology named after her, which has actually been very successful.
When something like this happens, for everybody, whole communities, to feel sucked in and feel grief and distress and fear about something like that. But you do have to take a step back and look at the perspective of it, and it was a unique event. It was just extraordinary, and please God, nothing ever like this happens again.
She had over 40 stab wounds to her body. It was a scene out of a horror movie.
Good evening. The savage knife murder of a young mother in broad daylight stunned detectives in London today.
There's a massive jolt to society that life is much more dangerous than it used to be.
She was 23 when she died. She was a shining light.
He talked about the sort of things the offender would be interested in, which was sexually sadistic fantasies.
You know, what sort of person could have done this to another human being? It was unbelievable. You know, it was frightening.
Today's developments bring another twist to the story, but the Common still holds its secret.
On the morning of the 15th of July, 1992, 23-year-old Rachel Nickel was getting ready to take her young son, Alex, for a walk. Less than 2 hours later, she would be dead. Across London, on the tough Alton estate in Roehampton, less than a mile from Wimbledon Common, local man Colin Stagg had woken up early and was preparing to leave his flat.
I initially did go on the Common very early in the morning, just to walk my dog. I remember I had a very bad headache that morning, so what would have normally been quite a long walk, which was a daily thing, I only did a short walk, just around a little pond called Skio Pond, and then back home again.
Colin returned to his flat to sleep off his headache. It was around 9:25 in the morning. A mile away, Rachel, Alex and their dog Molly had set off across Wimbledon Common for a stroll through the woods. As they enjoyed the early summer sun, they were totally unaware of the killer stalking them.
The area of the Common, as I recall, I mean, it was really quite wide open. I think the area had some tree cover around it, but essentially this was broad daylight. This was not an area you would think twice about going to.
She was killed on a path which was well frequented, probably less than 200 yards from an open green area on Wimbledon Common where mothers were walking their children.
Just minutes into the family's walk, the killer struck.
The attack was so ferocious, one of the blows that cut her throat, to silence her before the main attack, almost decapitated her. She had over 40 stab wounds to her body and throat. It was a scene out of a horror movie.
Police soon flooded the Common, quickly realizing that their crime scene stretched to over 1,000 acres of woodland that contained over 500 people on the morning of the murder. A murder that had only one eyewitness, a 2-year-old boy that had seen his mother butchered. Feeling better, Colin Stagg decided to head back to the Common to take his dog for a longer walk, a decision that would affect the rest of his life.
Saw a uniformed police officer standing on the Common side. He advised me not to go onto the Common because there'd been an incident. I basically asked him what it was. He said they'd found the body of a young girl. I told him that I'd been on the Common that morning, and he asked if I'd seen anything suspicious. And I just said no. He asked me for my name and address in case they needed to question me later, which I freely gave. And that was it, I just basically went home.
The Metropolitan Police assembled a crack team of detectives to work on the case.
From the start, the Nickel Murder Squad was hindered by lack of evidence. There was a minute speck of what at the time was regarded as organic material, but the science of the early 90s was not enough to mark it as DNA. So The police are starting from a very difficult place.
After a month of inquiries and hundreds of interviews, the detectives still seemed to be getting nowhere. They couldn't even categorically say whether Rachel's killer was male or female. Faced with a stalling investigation, the police took the unusual step of calling in a criminal profiler to provide a psychological assessment of the killer.
In the UK, psychological profiling was new. I was very personally cynical about what a profiler could offer, although not dismiss it. They're not going to be able to name the killer. What they might be able to do is put someone in a bracket and say, well, this type of individual is the sort of thing they could do.
The man the detectives turned to was Paul Britton, a renowned criminal psychologist who had worked on several high-profile cases in the past. Working hand in hand with the inquiry team, Britton was asked to profile Rachel Nickell's killer.
There were two profiles written, one which I guess we might call a demographic profile, someone between 20 and 30 with isolated hobbies who probably lives on his own and probably doesn't live very far from the common. And the second one was this so-called sexual fantasy profile where he talked about the sort of things the offender would be interested in, which was sexually sadistic fantasies, and he actually listed some of these. Would be interested in knives and the occult and that type of thing.
The profiles, along with a photo fit of a possible suspect, were featured in a national TV appeal. The broadcast prompted hundreds of calls from members of the public, and many were claiming they knew who the man in the photo fit was.
The police were inundated with calls, putting a name to this face, Colin Francis Stagg.
The pathologist, Dr. Richard Shepherd, told the inquest it was a frenzied attack. The killer kept up the stabbing even after her death. She'd been sexually molested.
The image of her, the beautiful blonde model, is an iconic image now, and it seems to speak to the loss of innocence of a period of time when a young woman couldn't take her child out in the middle of the day on a summer's day. So it became one of these cases that put incredible pressure on the police.
There are suspects. 4 men were spotted near the scene. Perhaps the most important was the one seen washing his hands in this stream shortly after the murder. He, like the others, hasn't been traced, and the police fear that if it was the killer, he may strike again.
Faced with an almost complete lack of eyewitness and forensic evidence, the police asked criminal psychologist Paul Britton to devise a profile of the killer. This profile, along with a well-publicised photo fit of a suspect seen near the murder site, led to the spotlight falling on a local man, Colin Stagg, who lived a few minutes' walk from Wimbledon Common.
Early in the morning, it was about 8, 9 o'clock I think it was, someone was knocking on my door. I opened it and it was plainclothes officers. And they said they wanted to question me in regard to the Rachel Nickell murder.
To be fair to the police, they had interviewed other suspects. They had followed up other leads. But as time wore on, those leads and those suspects petered out. The only man who figured large and was to do so for the next 2 years was Colin Stagg.
I'd never been arrested for anything in my life at that time, and being accused of something like that, and it was like, I was in a different world. It was strange. Lots of police officers came in, they searched my home, top to bottom. I had a couple of books about the occult and stuff like that, and they focused on that. After they searched my place, they took me to the Wimbledon police station, and then they held me for 3 days.
As the police began to question their suspect, they were presented with a huge stroke of luck. Colin Stagg was about to reveal a piece of information that would convince detectives he was the killer.
I can see why Colin Stagg rose to the top of this inquiry. He almost offered himself up, quite frankly. He was on the common at the time. He's a known loner, nothing wrong with that, but sometimes with that, perceived to be just a little bit odd in some way or another.
I'd never been arrested before for any crime, and it was very, very scary.
Amazingly for the police officers involved, he talked frankly and openly. He didn't deny anything, but other than to insist that he had not murdered this young mother.
As police continued to question Colin, a search of past incidents on the common delivered a breakthrough.
They discovered a sighting by a woman of a man who was lying naked on the common, who she claimed exposed himself to her.
Basically, I was just doing nude sunbathing, which I did in a regular spot every summer. And it was an area used by nude sunbathers. I pleaded guilty to it because I thought, well, basically, I've been advised to by my solicitor, and I just wanted to get out of there. I didn't want these things to drag on, so I thought, get rid of it. I got a fine for £200, and after that, I was released after 3 days.
That decision was to have long and lasting effects on the case and his life.
Stagg's naivety fueled the police's theory that he matched Paul Britton's profile of the killer. As Colin returned to his life on the Alton estate, where he assumed the trauma of the past few months was behind him for good, an innocent decision he'd made years before the killing of Rachel Nickel was about to come back to haunt him.
I think it was about 2 years prior to the murder of Rachel Nickel. I answered a dating advert for friendship, and so I wrote a letter to Julie Pines. We got on okay, we chatted on the telephone at first, and we seemed to be okay. And then, being a normal red-blooded man, I thought, this could go a bit further. So I just chanced my arm, really, and wrote her a sexual letter. It was just of a mild sexual fantasy of meeting a woman in the open air, getting on together and having sex together in the open air. And she kept that letter for 2 years, and she contacted the police when I was arrested for those 3 days, and that was it. And the police, once they read that letter, and of course Rachel Nickel was murdered in the woodlands, they seemed to find a connection with that.
After a detailed examination of the letter from Julie Pines, the police were now even more certain that Colin had murdered Rachel Nickel. But they were still completely unable to prove it. Faced with an ever-mounting pressure from both senior officers and the public, the inquiry team hit upon a daring idea.
It was believed, and now we know hugely problematically, that it would be useful to get an undercover operative in there to evaluate whether Stagg had any guilty knowledge of the case.
The inquiry team wasted no time in recruiting a star female undercover officer known during and after the operation as Lizzie James. With her in place, and after lengthy consultations with Paul Britton, Operation Edsel, as it was codenamed, began. The carefully concocted plan, made with the approval of senior Metropolitan police officers and lawyers, was that Lizzie should write to Colin and earn his trust, in the hope he would reveal some intimate knowledge of the crime.
I received a letter from a woman calling herself Lizzie James, and she claimed that she was a friend of Julie Pines, and she had read the letter and she found it interesting, and she wanted to get to know me.
The first letter was something like, Dear Colin, you might remember a lady called Julie Pines.
Dear Colin, I hope you're not offended by this intrusion, as we've never met before.
Julie was fairly closed-minded. I'm a lot more open-minded, and basically I want to start a dialogue with you. Of course, Stagg, 30-year-old guy, getting a bit of attention from a woman, writes back.
Dear Lizzie, thank you so much for your letter, which I read with great interest.
We struck up a conversation. I sent letters to her, she'd send letters to me.
I'm sure your fantasies hold no bounds, and you're as broad-minded and uninhibited as I am.
Some of the early letters by Stagg show his degree of naivety, where he talks about making parsnip wine, and we'll go out on the veranda and have our parsnip wine, and I'll kiss you and cuddle you, and it's all pretty benign stuff. And then in a very significant letter that she writes back, she says, I need you to show me what a real man is.
The things that happened when I was with this man were not what normal people would like. And even though these things are bad and I feel guilty, I can never forget how exhilarating they made me feel.
Now, there's only so many ways you can take that, so unsurprisingly, in the next letter, Stagg plays back that exact verbatim sentence. I'll show you who a real man is. And then in the next letter, Lizzie James writes back, I need to feel defenceless and humiliated. And guess what? In the next letter, Stagg uses those exact terms, defenceless and humiliated.
In all my letters, I would always say, is this the kind of thing you mean? Is this the kind of thing that you like? If not, I apologise, you know, because I was a lot younger, never had a real sexual relationship with a woman, so I would have told any woman anything what they wanted to hear if I thought I was going to have sex back then.
The exchange of letters continued, and the content quickly became more sexual and violent. To the detectives, it seemed Stagg was playing right into their hands. Encouraged by the results, they decided to have the couple meet in London's Hyde Park.
I remember the day clearly. I thought she was late. Then I saw this woman, long blonde hair, quite attractive. So I said, you know, excuse me, are you Lizzie James? And she said she was, and she realised who I was. And that was the first meeting we had.
His first encounter with Lizzie was not the private affair that Colin had hoped for. The park was full of undercover officers watching every move he made, each of them fully aware that one of their colleagues was meeting with a supposed sadistic killer. Over lunch, Lizzie James wasted no time in appealing to what the team thought was Colin's dark side.
That's when she told me she had a dark secret.
I've got quite an extreme appetite for some things.
Her ex-boyfriend was into black magic and stuff, and she claimed that she had done a human sacrifice of a pregnant woman and a baby.
Yeah, we did. And things got pretty heated, and yeah, we screwed around.
At first I thought, oh, she's a nutter, you know, she's off her head. But she was very attractive. And again, all I was thinking about was like, yeah, you know, just in one ear and out the other.
Ever eager to impress Lizzie, Colin responded to her dark secret with a violent fantasy of his own. It wasn't long before their exchanges turned to the murder on Wimbledon Common.
I told her, I think I was on the second or the third meeting, that I had been arrested for the Rachel Nickel murder. And she found that very exciting. Lizzie James wanted me to be the murderer. She said she could only be with a man who could have committed that crime and to have sex with that man. And I just kept saying, no, sorry, it's not me. You know, I kept apologising and saying, you know, sorry, it's not me, I didn't do it.
Throughout the entire operation, Colin Stagg never once suggested he had anything to do with the Nickel murder. But despite this, the sexual content of his letters to Lizzie James was exactly what Paul Britton and the police thought they would see from the killer. On the 17th of August 1993, Stagg was re-arrested on suspicion of murder.
Myself and my solicitor, we sat in a room being interviewed by the police, and they were reading some of my letters out that I'd written to Lizzie James. Yeah, I felt obviously very small because I thought, you know, there were personal letters between two consenting adults. And it was at that point one officer left the room and he came in with Lizzie James.
Hi, Colin. Remember me?
I knew straight away then that she was part of this. I couldn't say anything, you know, because I was just saying no comment all the time. But what I really wanted to say was like, you know, well, you fucking started this, you know. You wrote to me, I didn't write to you. So that was it. And then I was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickel.
With their prime suspect safely behind bars, the murder squad celebrated a job well done. However, what they didn't and couldn't know was that for the past months, all their efforts had been focused on the wrong man. The real killer of Rachel Nickel was still at large. And in the autumn of 1993, he was preparing to strike again. Back in 1989, a brutal rape in Plumstead, southeast London, marked the start of a series of attacks that would blight the area for the next 4 years.
A woman with children in the house was getting the kids ready for school, and the back door was left open. She turned around after drying her hair to see the offender standing there with a knife, threatening her and threatening to attack the children if she didn't comply.
And that rape was the first of what became known as the Green Chain Rapes, which was a series of attacks along Green Chain Walk in southeast London. These rapes went on for a number of years and no one was caught for them.
Tragically, the Green Chain Rapes could have been stopped after the first attack. The police received a call about the Plumstead rape in August 1989. The caller was the rapist's mother, and her son had just confessed to her. His name was Robert Napper.
He confessed to her that he'd raped a woman, and his mother took him at his word and went to the police and said, look, my son's confessed to raping a woman. Has anybody been raped recently around Plumstead Common?
The police checked their records, but no trace of an attack was found. Had the crime been properly investigated, one of the worst killers in British history could have been stopped in his tracks.
Robert Napper is one of a very unusual and small set of offenders, mercifully rare, that really are, well, it's basically known as a sexual sadist, a sexually sadistic killer. There's some suggestion that he was abused before the age of 10, and apparently by someone quite close to him, although specifically who that is, we don't know. I think what's significant about him as a child and as an adult is this isolation. Isolation from his peers, isolation from friends, and isolation from family, which got more and more extreme also throughout his criminal career. We also know that he had Asperger's, which is a learning difficulty as well, which probably added to that isolation.
Throughout the 1990s, the Green Chain Walk, a tranquil series of linked parks in southeast London, was the location of some of the most terrifying rapes London had ever witnessed. The attacks would continue for months, increasing in brutality, until when, in early summer of 1992, just weeks before Rachel Nickell was killed, Napper attacked a woman walking with a child.
Napper jumped out at her, pushed her to the ground, tried to strangle her in front of her child and brutally raped her while she pleaded for him not to kill her. The similarities between this and the Nickell murder a few weeks later, when you look back on it, are so stark. But it didn't seem to be picked up at the time. I mean, hindsight, as we say, is a marvellous thing, but it was very similar, and the crucial thing was she had her child with her.
Not only were the Green Chain attacks not linked to the murder of Rachel Nickell, a succession of missed clues meant that Napper was free to carry on his reign of terror. Twice, he was asked to give a DNA sample after his neighbours positively identified him from a photo fit of the Green Chain suspect. In both cases, he didn't turn up at the police station, and incredibly, this wasn't followed up. In November 1993, 16 months after Rachel Nickell's killing, and with Colin Stagg awaiting trial for murder, London was rocked by news of another terrible crime.
What has shocked police is the ferocity of the murders. A senior officer said Sam Bissett's injuries were horrific.
Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine lived together with Samantha's boyfriend Conrad Ellum in Plumstead, southeast London.
Samantha was a very strong personality. Before she had Jasmine, she was quite wayward. But then when she had Jasmine, it gave her more focus in life, I guess. And she was a very devoted mother. I should remember Jasmine, she's an adorable little child. I mean, she was a lovely girl. I take her to the swings and she just think it was brilliant. She just think it was an amazing day out, just going to the swings for a couple of hours and, you know, she was so happy.
As Samantha and Jasmine carried on with their lives, Robert Napper had already begun stalking them.
She never had curtains, you know, and sometimes she'd walk around the flat naked. And I'd say, look, you know, you should be careful here. There could be, like, a peeping Tom looking in. And it was only a week or so before the murder when she did actually see someone looking in through a bedroom window one night. I think after that she was a bit more careful, but I guess it was too late by then. I let myself in, and straight away, I mean, I saw this stain on the carpet. Walked into the front room and saw, I mean, Sam had actually been covered over, so there wasn't much to see, but I'm standing there looking at this sort of pile of clothes and all the bloodstains and things, and it took quite a while for me to sort of actually grasp what had happened. And then thought, well, what about Jasmine? I felt bad that I hadn't even thought about it. I thought I'd phone the police without even checking on Jasmine. I thought she might still be alive. Jasmine was in the bed with the covers over her. And for a second I thought maybe she's still alive, but then there was no movement, she wasn't breathing. So then I phoned the police.
The investigation into the Bissett murders was headed up by Detective Superintendent Mickey Banks.
Yeah, it was, I would say, the most gruesome scene I've ever attended. You know, I did 32.5 years. I'd never seen a scene like that, or an accident, or anything as bad as this. Obviously, the body had been left there to be displayed, as if to say, look what I've done, look what I'm capable of, and I immediately thought this has got to be some nutter.
As forensic investigators examined the flat, they began to piece together what they thought had happened.
Sam's going about her business with Jasmine in the house, and there's a knock on the door. At that point, a very sudden, violent attack takes place where Napa immediately stabs her with a knife, takes her into the lounge, and then commits some horrific acts of mutilation on her. Very shortly after that, also rapes and murders Jasmine, a 4-year-old girl. So a really horrendous and horrific offence.
One of the first things that struck Mickey Banks was that his case could be linked to the Green Chain rapes. To test this theory, he enlisted the help of the criminal profiler who had worked on the Green Chain rape inquiry and the Rachel Nickel murder investigation, Paul Britton.
The amazing thing about Paul Britton's involvement was that he was involved as an advisor on the Green Chain rapes. He was an advisor on the Bissett murder, and he was an advisor in the Stagg case. And at no point does he talk about the possibility of them being linked. And he worked on all 3 cases, and Napa walked through all 3 of them, completely unseen.
By early 1994, there were 3 different police inquiries running in South London, all independently and unknowingly investigating the crimes of one man, Robert Napa. The Green Chain team had ruled out Napa as a suspect for being too tall. Tellingly, they had not pursued him when he had twice failed to provide a DNA sample. Mickey Banks had also invited the Rachel Nickel murder squad to Plumstead to discuss whether their respective crimes could be linked.
They'd already charged Stagg, and they were convinced that they had the right man. This was the attitude I got from their officers when they came to visit us, and we discussed both cases, but they would only tell me what they wanted me to know. They were convinced Stagg was their murderer. It was as simple as that.
Paul Britton, the one man who had intimate knowledge of both cases, reinforced the lack of connection between the Nickel and Bissett murders.
I think Mickey Banks says to Paul Britton, are they not linked? And Paul Britton says, no, they're not linked because it doesn't have the same degree of frenzy. And my answer to that is, well, it's pretty simple, that if you've got a victim inside a house and in a confined area, you can do more or less what you want with them, and you can express whatever weird, sexually deviant fantasies you have.
Paul Britton would later suggest that he in fact had claimed the attacks could be linked. The Metropolitan Police dispute this version of events. Eventually, the Bissett murder squad received the break they had been waiting for. In a twist of fate, the fingerprints of victim Samantha Bissett were uncannily similar to those of Robert Napa. And in the first sweep of the crime scene, they were assumed to be the same prints. However, a re-examination had spotted the differences, and detectives now had a fingerprint of their killer.
There was a fingerprint found which matched about 6 or 7 points of Napa's fingerprints. This was found on the balcony outside the address, and was subsequently found to be partially comparable to him. He became a very good suspect for us.
The police had his fingerprints on file from a number of different offences. So as soon as they realised that these were someone else's prints, they looked on their computer and his name came up.
Not only did Robert Napa appear in the system, it was later revealed that police files were littered with clues that pointed to him being a depraved sex offender. Clues that were, at the time, largely ignored.
Robert Napa had cropped up on the police radar at least 8 times before he murdered Samantha Bissett and her daughter. And I think most significantly is in 1992 when he was arrested for stalking a civilian employee at the police station in Plumstead. And police went round to his flat and searched his flat. They found an A to Z with pages marked in it of Plumstead Common. Marked and annotated in the side were comments about women and women being covered up in cling film and women being abused and violent acts towards women. He didn't make any links with the Green Chain rapes, with anything else. And then he was released and there he was back on the streets again.
Thankfully, the detectives investigating the Bissett murders 2 years later were more attentive, and Mickey Banks and his team spent months assembling evidence against Napper. Along with the fingerprint, they found a bloody footprint in Samantha Bissett's kitchen that they matched to a pair of Napper's shoes. This, along with reported sightings of Robert Napper in the area at the time of the murders, was enough for Banks.
Well, his interview was stone cold. He seemed as if he was looking down on us, that he knew something we didn't know, and he seemed, to my mind, that he was sort of, you're never going to find out, I'm who I am, I'm better than you. In his own mind, he was laughing at us.
In May 1994, Robert Napper was charged with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. A DNA sample taken at the time also proved conclusively that Napper was the Green Chain rapist. He was placed on remand, awaiting trial. Across London, another remand prisoner, Colin Stagg, was about to have his day in court. Charged with the murder of Rachel Nickel, it wouldn't just be Stagg on trial. Also under scrutiny would be the Metropolitan Police themselves, and the audacious operation to ensnare their suspect.
After 14 months on remand in Wandsworth Jail, Colin Stagg arrived at the Old Bailey.
Going up into the courts is a very frightening thing. I mean, especially if you know you're innocent.
The police and the prosecution seemed quite confident with the material they'd got. And yet I was talking to sort of experienced court reporters and other crime correspondents who were sort of looking at each other thinking, how are they going to get away with this?
Colin's defence team had employed a series of experts to analyse Operation Edsel and its findings. They quickly realised it was littered with problems.
In my analysis of what Stagg revealed, there is actually nothing very unusual at all. There are several pathways that Stagg tries to satisfy Lizzie James, where he'll say, you know, I'm kind of interested in this, are you?
I'm so glad that you like my letters, and that you too are as broad-minded and uninhibited as me. I can't wait to read some of your fantasies.
And he's trying to feel out what she's kind of interested in. And of course, where he hits gold is where she reinforces him, if you like, and throws him a bone every time he says something which is either violent or sexually sadistic.
I believe I will only ever feel fulfilled again if I meet a man who has the same history as me.
He talks about another man using a knife on a woman, on the common. And then, of course, bingo, the inquiry team think this is exactly what we thought we'd see. But it's a completely self-fulfilling prophecy because they only saw what they wanted to see by virtue of only reinforcing those elements that got them there.
After listening to the evidence against Colin Stagg, the judge in the hearing had decided that enough was enough, and he wasted no time in throwing out the evidence from the undercover operation, dismissing it as a honey trap.
As the detective in charge of that, you could not have listened to the judge's words and be in any doubt that he was not only dismissing the case, he was seriously angry about the way in which Colin Stagg had been led.
With their case in tatters, the Rachel Nickel murder squad were left to reflect on the events of the past 2 years. The team had taken over 4,500 statements, and the inquiry was said to have cost over £3 million. Despite the murder investigation being, at the time, the most expensive in British criminal history, the squad were left with nothing.
You wonder why did no one say, hold on, what's the judge going to think of this?
Colin Stagg left the Old Bailey after 14 months in prison a free man. The judge's ruling meant that his case wouldn't be heard by a jury. But Colin was about to face a different trial, this time by the media and the public.
When Colin Stagg was released from prison, he was mobbed. The pictures, we all know the pictures of him coming out of court and being mobbed. And instead of being treated as an innocent man, he was treated as a killer who'd got off.
All the crowds were there and police on horseback, and everybody was just shouting out, and all I can hear is like, you know, hang him, guilty, guilty, hang him.
Minutes later, a statement was read out by Rachel Nickel's father.
I understand that the police will now keep the files on my daughter's murder open, but they are not looking for anyone else.
Releasing a statement that is so absolutely positive that we are not looking for anything else, that is a big message to deliver. You are saying to everyone out there, we know who this man is.
The law has been upheld, but where is the justice?
I'm surprised we ever made that statement.
Colin Stagg returned to his flat and would spend the next 14 years as a social pariah. To most people, he was the man who got away with murder. In the autumn of 1995, the focus was back on the Old Bailey, this time for the trial of Robert Napper, charged with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. As the prosecution made the final touches to its case, the detectives received some unexpected news.
We got a phone call to say he was going to plead guilty, he was going to plead diminished responsibility. What did we think of that? And I said I was quite satisfied with it. I mean, I believe he was diminished. That there was he wasn't so mad that he didn't know what he was doing. He knew what he was doing, but there was something totally wrong with him.
In October 1995, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He also confessed to 1 rape and 2 attempted rapes. He was sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital indefinitely. The relatives of Samantha and Jasmine left court to rebuild their shattered lives.
It's strange how odd little things can remind me sometimes. Just a particular song on the radio that Sam liked, or there's always things like that. And it's always strange. I don't go over to Plumstead that much, but I do sometimes still go over past the flat, and it is always strange to walk past it and see the place. I should remember Jasmine. She's an adorable little child. I mean, she was a lovely girl.
The relatives of Rachel Nickel had no such closure. It would be another 7 years until a breakthrough in the case was found. In 2002, a case review team began poring over the evidence amassed in the decades since Rachel's murder. Every witness statement was re-looked at. Unknown offenders and possible suspects were re-examined. One of the first names that was flagged up was a sexually sadistic killer currently detained in Broadmoor, Robert Napper. At the same time, scientists were taking advantage of rapid advances in technology to review the forensic evidence found on Rachel Nickel's body.
There was a small amount of DNA on Rachel Nickel's jogging pants, and that was tested, and you are able from that now, although they weren't then, to rule people out. And Stagg was ruled out as being a forensic link to that DNA. The second piece of evidence was there were some very small paint flecks that were found in Alex Hanscom's, the little child's, hair, that they were able to link and actually match to paint flecks on Robert Napper's metal toolbox.
Further analysis of the DNA proved that Robert Napper had been in contact with Rachel Nickel on the day she died. The paint flecks found in her son Alex's hair were the final confirmation. Armed with this new evidence, Robert Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickel. He appeared at the Old Bailey on the 18th of December, 2008.
It's now thought that as well as being a triple murderer, Robert Napper could be responsible for up to 70 sexual assaults. They took place in South London parks like here at Plumstead Common, close to the Thames, the so-called green chain rapes. But if police had properly investigated reports that were put to them by members of the public, including Napper's own mother, then Samantha and Jasmine Bissett and Rachel Nickel wouldn't be dead.
He sat there and he didn't flinch, and he He was a kind of presence of evil. I don't often say this, but he appeared to be like that, and it was the most tense courtroom I've ever been in, actually, and it really brought tears to your eyes, because then you could just see her parents finally, they'd got the right man, and it was really, really moving, actually.
Mr. Napper has been found guilty of Rachel's murder. That means in total, he's murdered 2 women, 1 child, raped at least 1 woman, and attempted to rape 2 others.
Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickel on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was sent back to Broadmoor, with the judge stating he was unlikely ever to be released. Napper's admission of guilt brought to a close one of the most notorious cases in British criminal history.
It's since emerged that in August 1993, a knife was found on Wimbledon Common, near where Rachel Nickel was murdered. That knife was matched to Robert Napper when he was arrested in 1994. And again, nothing was done. Stagg was in jail on remand, nothing was done. So they had a knife with his fingerprints on, they had clues as to his stalking grounds, his raping grounds in his A to Z. They had all the evidence of a violent stalker, rapist, potentially killer, and they didn't put 2 and 2 together. I think that was just bad policing, total incompetence.
It wasn't until 2010 that the Independent Police Complaints Commission delivered their damning report on Operation Edsel, and how Napper was able to avoid the police's clutches for so long. The Nickel case, along with other high-profile crimes, led to dramatic changes in police tactics.
Since the Rachel Nickel murder, the way murders are investigated have changed beyond recognition. Nowadays, you have dedicated murder investigation teams who are specialists, and with that, what has evolved from that is probably the most effective way of investigating murder anywhere in the world.
Colin Stagg, for so long at the heart of the case, would receive over £700,000 in compensation from the Home Office, as well as an apology from the Metropolitan Police. The shadow of the murder, however, has stayed with him.
There are still people today who don't know that they've actually got the man who did kill Rachel Nickel. They always say to me, like, did they ever get the bloke who did it? I'm like, yes, they did, but it amazes me that the Robert Napper arrest and charge didn't get as much press coverage as what it did with me. And it should have done. It made people realise that they have got the man who did it.
He was, for years, treated as a pariah, and his life was ruined. He wasn't serving a sentence inside, but he was serving a sentence outside. And had Napper never been caught, Colin Stagg would still be the man who killed Rachel Nickel to this day, I think.